Welcome back. I'm Lew Miller. In part one, we saw how Lincoln made himself into a national political figure. Here in part two, we will see how Lincoln's team gained him the Republican nomination for president. We begin with a look at some presidential election maps from previous years. These are from 1844, 48, and 52. What I want you to notice is that in all cases, the winning candidate wins states in both the North and the South. That's what it took to gain enough electoral votes to win a national election. But look what happens in 1856. The winning Democratic candidate in blue swept the southern states, but only took a few in the North. Let's take a closer look, because 1856 holds the key for the Republicans in 1860. Lincoln's old Whig Party had disintegrated to be replaced by the new Republican Party, seen here in red. Population trends were moving against the South. The northern states had attracted millions of immigrants from Europe in the preceding 15 years, from the Irish potato famine, and from failed revolutions in the German states. The vast majority of these immigrants had settled in the North, where there was more opportunity and more upward mobility. Now, by the late 1850s, the northern free states, because of their population growth, had enough electoral votes to elect a president all by themselves. In 1856, John Fremont, the Republican candidate, had lost to Buchanan, the Democrat. However, if we add the votes for the Republicans and the know-nothing anti-immigrant third party, between them they received over 54% of the popular vote, almost all of it in the North. The reason Buchanan won was because, besides sweeping the South, he was able to win 4 lower North border states: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. Republicans realized that if they could hold on to all the other red states and win 3 of those 4 border states, they could elect a president. This gave the Republicans a blueprint for how to win in 1860, and it gave them a guide for what to look for in selecting a candidate, someone who could win in those lower North states. But before we get to the Republican convention that would select their nominee, we need to see what the Democrats are up to. The building in the center of this photograph, just to the left of the Teetotal restaurant, is Institute Hall in Charleston, South Carolina. It was where, in April, the Democrats held their national convention to choose their candidate. Charleston was hot and humid, and there were not enough hotel rooms for all the delegates, so many ended up sleeping on cots in dormitories. It was not a pleasant experience. The front-runner for the nomination was Stephen Douglas. He already had a majority of the delegates in his corner, but the party had a rule that the presidential nominee must be chosen by a 2/3 majority of the convention, and Douglas had enemies. One of them was the President of the United States, James Buchanan. He and Douglas had fallen out over party policy about slavery in the territories. Buchanan wanted it, and Douglas had staked his reputation on his "I don't care, leave it to the people to decide," which meant that it might happen or it might not. That wasn't good enough for Buchanan. The other major force opposed to Douglas was the powerful Democratic senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis. Davis always thought of himself as, and acted like, an aristocrat, and he dismissed Douglas, his Senate colleague, with the words, "He's white trash." Douglas was also interested in becoming the Democratic nominee. Between them, Buchanan and Davis controlled enough delegates to deny Douglas the 2/3 majority he needed. It was ruled by the minority. 1/3 plus 1 could stop Douglas. The delegates voted 57 times over 10 days, and Douglas always received a majority of the votes, but never 2/3. Finally, the convention adjourned to meet again in Baltimore in June. There they once again renewed the stalemate. The Southern delegates walked out and staged their own mini-convention, where they nominated the Vice President of the United States, John Brackenridge, for president on a Southern Democratic ticket. We will meet Brackenridge next. The Northern delegates, now left alone, nominated Douglas as the nominee of a Northern Democratic Party. The party had split in two. The way was open for a Republican candidate, at least for the right one, who could win those lower North states, to take over the presidency. This is John Cable Brackenridge. In 1860, he was just 39 years old. He was the only son of a politically prominent Kentucky family, married with 7 children. One of his Kentucky cousins, who he occasionally visited in her home in Springfield, Illinois, was Mary Todd, who had become Mary Todd Lincoln. Breckenridge's connections got him elected to Congress at age 30, where he met and became friends and sometimes business partners with Stephen Douglas. In 1856, he was selected to balance the Democratic Party's ticket with a Northerner, Buchanan, and a Southerner, Breckenridge. He became the youngest man in American history to be elected president. And in 1860, at Baltimore, he became the front man for the Southern Democrats' ill-advised decision to split the party over the issue of the expansion of slavery. When the Civil War broke out, Breckenridge joined the Confederate Army and fought against Union troops in many battles, including Shiloh and Missionary Ridge. Jefferson Davis later appointed him Confederate States Secretary of War. If things weren't complicated enough, what with the split in the Democratic Party, another party had formed and nominated its presidential candidate at a convention in early May. This was the Constitutional Union Party, one made up mostly of former Southern members of the defunct Whig Party. It might as well have been called the Can't We All Just Get Along Party, as it refused to take a position on any issue, and their entire platform consisted of the Constitution as it is and the Union as it is, whatever that was supposed to mean. Their hope was that no one would win an electoral majority and the election would be sent into the House of Representatives, where maybe some compromise candidate could be chosen. Their vice presidential candidate, on the right, was Edward Everett, who 3 years later would deliver the main address at the dedication of a battlefield cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is the Constitutional Union's presidential candidate, John Bell of Tennessee. He was a Tennessee lawyer who had been a competent, if unexciting, politician for over 30 years. What made him attractive to the party, based on finding compromise, was that he was a wealthy slaveholder who actually did not want slavery to expand to the territories. He was basically on both sides of the issue. His nomination was essentially a Hail Mary pass attempting to prevent a Republican from being elected, something they feared would lead to civil war. His problem was he was not someone people could get excited about. He represented a party looking for a compromise in a nation where few voters wanted to compromise, and there was no national base for his campaign. Consequently, few voted for him because few believed he had a chance. Now, we reach the Republican nominating convention. This is the building where they met in Chicago. Please note, they were meeting in Chicago, Illinois, Lincoln's home state. The building was made of wood and was built in just a month, specifically to host the convention. Its capacity was a rather astounding 10,000 people, and it would be packed each of the 3 days of the convention. With the split in the Democratic Party and the weak third-party compromise effort, most political pundits thought it quite likely that the nominee chosen by the Republicans would be the next president. And most of those pundits were certain that the nominee would be the New York Senator William Seward. It was not an accident or a coincidence that the Republican convention met in Lincoln's home state. And the advantage that gave Lincoln over the other potential nominees was considerable, possibly even determinative. Judge Davis saw the contest as a two-man race between Lincoln and Seward, and all his activities were intended to counter Seward. Norman Judd had convinced the National Republican Committee, when it met earlier in the year to choose a convention city, that Chicago was a perfect neutral site since Illinois had no prominent candidate for the ticket. Judge said this knowing Illinois would be heavily for Lincoln. When the National Committee took its final vote, the result was 11 votes for Chicago and 10 votes for St. Louis. Had the convention been held in St. Louis, it is quite conceivable Lincoln would not have been the nominee. Spectators needed a ticket to gain entrance to the wigwam. Lincoln's team printed and distributed thousands of counterfeit tickets and told Lincoln supporters to show up early. When Seward supporters showed up, there were over 2,000 of them, sent to Chicago from New York on 13 train loads. There would be no more room, and most of the place was packed with Lincoln supporters. Judd, as the chairman of the host state Republican Party, had the power to arrange the seating of the delegates on the convention floor. He put Seward's New York delegation on the far right, surrounded by delegations friendly to Lincoln. And then he put the Illinois delegation on the far left, surrounded by delegations still open to a deal, and close enough for Lincoln men to walk over and talk. And finally, as we will soon see, Davis made two critical last-minute deals with Indiana and Pennsylvania. Now let's meet the other contenders besides Lincoln for the nomination. This is William Henry Seward. He was 59 years old, married with 6 children. Among all the various candidates, he had not had a parent, a child, or a spouse die. He had been in politics for over 30 years as governor and senator from New York. He had always taken an outspoken stand against slavery, and he supported the rights of blacks and immigrants and Catholics, not favored groups among the white men voters of the day. His home in upstate New York was part of the Underground Railroad. He was also a charming guy. He became very good friends with Lincoln later on, and he had many friendships across party lines. 2 of his best friends in Washington were Jefferson Davis and John Brackenridge. He had helped co-found the Republican Party. He was everyone's odds-on favorite to win the nomination. However, he had a long political record, fertile ground for opponents to mine for out-of-context sound bites to make him look bad. His views on slavery were considered radical and out of the mainstream, and his support for immigrant rights had made him persona non grata with those former Know-Nothing Party members who made up substantial portions of the voters in those battleground northern states, voters the Republican candidate, whoever he was, would need to carry those states. And finally, his campaign manager was Thurlow Weed, who everyone considered to be a corrupt political boss. So there were serious doubts as to whether Seward could win the states needed for a Republican victory. This is Salmon Portland Chase, former governor of Ohio and now Republican senator from Ohio. He was a brilliant lawyer and courageously devoted his practice in Cincinnati, a very southern town in its outlook, to anti-slavery causes. Lincoln would end up appointing him as Secretary of the Treasury, and while he began by knowing nothing of finance, he worked very hard at it, and he was the reason that the North had the funding to win the Civil War. So he was a very able guy in many ways. On the other hand, he always had to be the smartest guy in the room, which he often was. But because of his ego, he just had to let everybody else in the room know it. And for someone who spent a great deal of his life in politics, he was not very good at playing the political game. He didn't even bother to appoint a campaign manager to control his Ohio delegates, and by the time the convention opened, some members of his own delegation were openly opposing his nomination. This is Edward Bates, an extremely competent Missouri lawyer and politician. He was by far the oldest candidate at age 67. He had actually fought in the War of 1812. His reputation was that of a solid, workmanlike politician. But realistically, the only reason he was being considered was because he was a favorite of the influential Francis Preston Blair family. Blair, who owned a mansion in Washington known as Blair House, which later became property of the United States government, thought of himself as a party kingmaker. He had arranged for John Fremont to be the 1856 nominee, and in fact was able to get his son, Montgomery Blair, appointed Attorney General in Lincoln's cabinet. Bates was the choice of conservative Republicans who didn't want to scare away voters with a radical candidate. His problem was that he was a known racist, and as a former know-nothing, the German-American members of the Republican Party distrusted him. He would be a tough sell to voters in key northern states like Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin, where immigrants were prevalent. But he did have support among the more conservative Republicans, including the delegation from Delaware, which gave him their votes on the first ballot. Here's what the convention looked like inside the wigwam. The platform was adopted on the second day, and because the convention agenda for that day was at an end, a motion was made to begin the balloting for the president right away. By this point in the convention, Thurlow Weed, Seward's campaign manager in Chicago, had spread around enough cash and believed he had made all the necessary deals with delegations that the nomination was wrapped up for Seward. And it's quite possible it was. Had the vote been taken at the end of the second day, it is very likely that William Henry Seward would have been the Republican Party's nominee for president. Instead, the motion was denied because the secretaries had not yet prepared the paperwork necessary to record the voting totals as the roll call of the states was made. Given that opening, David Davis first wrapped up the support of the Indiana delegation by intimating to them that maybe in a future Lincoln cabinet, a cabinet position might be offered to an Indiana man, which, as it turned out, it was. He then held a late-night meeting with the leaders of the Pennsylvania delegation. Promises of some kind were exchanged. It is hard to pin down exactly what was said, but the Pennsylvania delegation agreed that on the second ballot, it would switch its votes from its native son, Senator Simon Cameron, to Lincoln. Cameron, a notoriously corrupt and incompetent man, would later be appointed Secretary of War in Lincoln's cabinet, a mistake that Lincoln would rectify within a year by firing him and installing Edwin Stanton in his place. Lincoln, who was home in Springfield, had previously sent a note to Davis saying, "Make no contracts that bind me." Davis considered this naive in the extreme. He responded to his team, "Lincoln ain't here, and we'll do what we have to do." Davis's convention strategy was playing out as he had envisioned it. Lincoln was the Cinderella candidate, not too conservative and not too radical. Davis's message to all the wavering delegations was, only a moderate can win the battleground states, and that man is Lincoln. He wanted everyone to see it was strictly a two-man race by getting Lincoln at least 100 votes on the first ballot. He positioned Lincoln as everyone's second choice, so that if their man didn't win on the first ballot, they would swing their votes to Lincoln on the second, and then win it on the third. Let's see how he did. In the first ballot, everybody expected Seward to be in the lead, and he was. But Lincoln was clearly the second runner with over 100 votes. As soon as the first ballot was announced, everybody realized this was, as Davis had envisioned, a two-man race. Watch what happens on the second ballot to the Pennsylvania votes. Pennsylvania held up its part of the bargain with Davis. Their votes swung to Lincoln, as did many others, including the state of Delaware, which jumped from Bates to Lincoln. And now everyone knew it was a two-man race. As soon as the second ballot votes were announced, the third ballot began. And when the third ballot votes were announced, the crowd exploded. Lincoln was within 2 votes of winning the 233 he needed to be the party's nominee. Before they could begin the next ballot, the Ohio manager stood on his chair and waved for recognition. When it was granted, he announced to the convention, "Mr. Chairman, the Ohio delegation wishes to switch 4 votes to Mr. Lincoln." And it was over. Lincoln was the Republican Party nominee for president. This is the cover of the Harper's Weekly magazine mailed out just after the convention. The text wrapping around the picture is a biography of Lincoln, introducing him to the nation. It noted that, quote, Mr. Lincoln received a limited education, end quote. Notice the picture of Lincoln. It is an engraving of the Matthew Brady photograph from 3 months earlier. It introduced that powerful, statesmanlike image of Lincoln to the country. Also note how they spelled Lincoln's first name throughout the article, Abram, A-B-R-A-M. And this was the man widely assumed to be the next president of the United States. This concludes part 2 of our presentation. In part 3, we will see how Lincoln directed a national campaign to bring him to the White House.